Everyone, in the last video we have discussed about formation of embryo sac. In that we have understood how embryo sac develops, in which what happens, 7 cells are there with 8 nuclei. 3 cells are arranged at the chalazal end, 3 cells are arranged at micropylar end, and one large cell, that is central cell, is arranged at the center with 2 polar nuclei. So that means here the embryo sac is having 7 cells and 8 nuclei, that is 8 nucleated and 7 celled. Now let us see here the next topic, pollination. What does pollination mean? You have studied this in the lower class, and here in this chapter we have been discussing about the development of male and female gamete. We discussed first about the male gamete, later on we discussed the female gamete, how they are produced. We have understood that is the pollen grain and embryo sac. Now here, how these two are going to come together, or how these two gametes, which are actually non-motile, means they are not able to move. Now they have to be brought together so that they can take part in fertilization process. How this will be achieved? So in order to achieve this fertilization, it is necessary to bring the gametes together, and this is done by a process which is called as pollination. That means pollination is a mechanism to achieve the objective of fertilization. In this, what happens, somehow the pollen grains has to be transferred from the anther, that is the male part, and pollen grain is the male gamete, to the stigma of the pistil, which is receptive. The stigma is the receptive part of the pistil. Now this process of transfer of male gamete, that is the pollen grain, from the anther to stigma is known as pollination. In flowering plant, now these different methods have evolved. Different patterns have been adapted by different plant species to achieve the process of pollination. And for this, what happens here, external agents are involved here. External agents, some are biotic, some are abiotic, means some living and some non-living. Now let us see first of all, now what are the kinds of pollination? Basically here, if we discuss kinds of pollination, 2 kinds of pollination we can classify here. One self pollination and another one is called as cross pollination. You have studied this in the lower class. Now here we are discussing, it is of 3 types. It is of 3 types. The first 2 over here, autogamy and geitonogamy. Autogamy and geitonogamy, both of them are a type of self pollination. Whereas when we talk about the xenogamy, this is cross pollination. So let us see these 3 types, but what you have studied earlier in lower classes was self and cross pollination. Now let us see these 3 types over here. The first one is talking about autogamy. Here I said what, autogamy and geitonogamy, both of them are self pollination, because here the pollen grains are being transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, or otherwise on another flower but the same plant. Now here let us see first of all autogamy. Now in this type, what happens, the pollination is achieved within the same flower. That means here the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. यहाँ पर फ्लावर चेंज नहीं हो रहा है, तो प्लांट का तो कोई बात करने की ज़रूरत नहीं है हमको, because we are talking about the same flower. Pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower has to be transferred. And in this, what happens, in a normal flower, that can open and be exposed so that the anther and stigma, okay, can go for self pollination, that is autogamy. But this is actually rare. ये काफ़ी rare होता है. Now if you see this point, in a normal flower which opens and exposes anthers and stigma, complete autogamy is rather rare. क्यों बोल रहे हैं? क्योंकि अगर मान लो कि the flowers are open, anther and stigmas are exposed, then there will be chances that the pollen grains are going to be transferred from one flower to another flower easily. So over here it is quite rare we are talking. Now here autogamy in such flower requires synchrony. Now what is the meaning of synchrony? मतलब ये हुआ कि the anther and the stigma, both of them should be becoming mature at the same time, simultaneously, or both of them pollen grains should be released, and that will be taking place only at the maturity. And simultaneously what is happening, the stigma also, that is the carpel also is mature. As a result of that, the stigma is the receptive part. Okay, so stigma can receive the pollen grain and help in further process for fertilization, means to affect the self pollination. First of all, pollination has to be done, and then later on fertilization has to take place. Now here what happens, both of these, once again, pollen grain and the stigma, pollen grain released from the anther and stigma should be receptive at the same time, so that what happens, this self pollination and then later on fertilization can be effective. Now over here one more thing is important, that both the stigma and anther has to lie very close to each other. Anther and stigma has to be very close to each other so that self pollination or otherwise autogamy is possible, because we are talking about transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of same flower. Now in some plants, example के लिए है viola, which is commonly called as common pansy, oxalis and commelina. In this what happens, two types of flowers are produced. One is chesmogamous and one is cleistogamous. Now in case of chesmogamous flowers, they are similar to the flower of other species. Now these flowers are similar to flowers of other species with exposed anthers and stigma. Whereas the cleistogamous flowers, they do not open at all, खुलते ही नहीं है. And in such flowers, the anther and stigma will be lying very close to each other. क्यों? Because it is not opening up. Now if you see into the plant over here, chesmogamous flowers are aerial, whereas cleistogamous flowers are underground, you can say. Okay, now over here there is no chance of opening the flowers. That means over here what happens, the anther and stigmas are not going to be exposed, they are very near to each other, so there is no other method of pollination possible here. So it has to go for only autogamy. That means what, over here when the anther is going to dehisce, means burst inside the flower budding condition, the pollen grains can easily come in contact with the stigma so that pollination can take place. Thus what happens here, cleistogamous flowers are invariably autogamous. क्यों? क्योंकि there is no other chance of cross pollen landing, क्योंकि दूसरे किसी फ्लावर का पोलन नहीं आ सकता है या फिर दूसरे फ्लावर पे नहीं जा सकता है in this condition. And that is why the flowers over here has been termed as what, cleistogamous flowers. That means the cleistogamous flowers assure what, seed set even in the absence of pollinator. दूसरा किसी एजेंट की जरूरत यहाँ पर नहीं पड़ रही है। एक्सटर्नल एजेंट बात कर रहे हैं, कोई भी इंसेक्ट हो, वाटर और विंड, any agent is not required here for pollination purpose. Now what are the advantages and disadvantages? Okay, that is one question given, we have to think about. Okay, then next one is geitonogamy. This also is a type of self pollination. Only thing over here, the transfer of pollen grain is taking place between two flowers on the same plant. दो अलग अलग फ्लावर है लेकिन प्लांट सेम है. सो दिस प्रोसेस ओवर हियर इज टर्म्ड एज geitonogamy. The transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant is geitonogamy. And though this geitonogamy is functionally cross pollination, देखा जाए तो क्रॉस पोलिनेशन है क्योंकि फ्लावर अलग अलग हैं, बट जेनेटिकली they are going to be similar to each other because they are present on the same plant. किसी और प्लांट पे किसी और प्लांट पर ट्रांसफर यहाँ पर नहीं हो रहा है. सेम प्लांट, वन ओनली थिंग द टू फ्लावर्स के बीच में हो रहा है on the same plant. So this process over here is called as geitonogamy. And the third one is xenogamy. Now in this what happens, the transfer of pollen grain is taking place between two flowers which are located on different plant. In this what happens, this is the only type of pollination in which there will be variability. मतलब ये जेनेटिकल वेरिएबिलिटी की बात कर रहे हैं. दो प्लांट हैं, दोनों के जेनेटिक कंस्टिट्यूशन डिफरेंट होंगे. नाउ व्हेन द पोलन ग्रेन्स आर गोइंग टू गेट ट्रांसफर फ्रॉम वन फ्लावर टू अनदर फ्लावर ऑन डिफरेंट प्लांट, and that plant after fertilization will form the seeds will have both characters from both the plants. That is why here if you see the point, this is the only type of pollination which during pollination brings genetically different types of pollen grain to the stigma. So that was about the types of pollination or kinds of pollination.